Thank you, Gene. 1986, Michael Jordan was perhaps the most dominant basketball player, definitely of that decade, if not of all time, and he was injured. So during the slam dunk contest, the sure thing was a young man by the name of Dominique Wilkins. Dominique stood at 6'8" and didn't need a contest to provide a lot of entertainment. However, one of his teammates, a gentleman by the name of Spud Webb, who stood at the incredible height of 5'6", beat him. He gave 14 inches away and still was able to beat him. In 1984, much of the world was captivated by a little-known 4', 8' firecracker by the name of Mary Lou Retton. For those of you who remember, she had the most incredible, she basically wore an American flag and stood at the end of her runway to do the bars, and she needed a perfect 10 in order to win the gold, and she was able to do just that and become perhaps the most famous athlete of that decade. A decade later, or 12 years later, in 1996, there was another 4'8" young lady named Carrie Stugg who needed a perfect score on a vault in order to win the gold medal, but the problem was she had a bad ankle. And so she stands at the end, kind of on one leg, runs the length, hits the vault, does the somersault flip or whatever they call it, and landed perfectly, and then raised her hand in triumph as she lifted her bad leg. She captivated a nation. She was 4'8". Huge. At 6'2", Franklin Delano Roosevelt served our country as commander-in-chief for 12 years, and he was a towering presence. It wasn't that he was just big, but he was an imposing figure in voice, in speech, in demeanor. He dominated a room. And he died abruptly, only to be replaced by one of our shortest presidents in history, 5'8", Harry Truman. But Harry went on to end World War II and serve valiantly as the commander-in-chief. In 1963, the computer mouse was born at Stanford Research Institute. The mouse, the thing, on your computer. Little small thing, right? At that time, it wasn't quite that small. It was about the size of a brick. But it wasn't until 20 years later that the device took off in the mid-'80s. And when that happened, that little device revolutionized the computer world and brought the cumbersome computer to you and I, the end user. Today, a pointing device is common. Hence, even on your phone, as you can just touch things, was a little known device known as the mouse. In 1903, a young lady by the name of Mary Anderson invented the windshield wiper. How about that, ladies? A small but essential piece in all of our vehicles that we drive today, right? In 1899, medical professionals were studying the effects of electrical impulses on the beating heart, or the heart that wasn't beating. And for the next 60 years, various apparatuses were built and studied. But it wasn't until 1958 that a wearable pacemaker was produced that began to extend the quality of life for hundreds and hundreds of people. Today, most pacemakers are the size of a 50-cent piece. Small. Small objects, small people. Small objects, small-statured people, but great accomplishments. Think about it in biblical terms, biblical examples. The rod. Moses had a rod. Just a simple rod. Nothing fancy, nothing big. It turned to a snake. When he picked it up, it was a rod again. It parted the waters. It led a nation to freedom. It turned the tide of battle. As long as the rod was up, the Israelites were winning. When he got tired, so he had people come alongside him to help hold the rod up. Small object. The Israelites used clay pots and trumpets to bring down Jericho. But perhaps the greatest example of small things in the Scripture doing big things is David's selection of 5 smooth stones to defeat Goliath. I want to encourage you today that it doesn't matter how tall you are, how big you are, how grand your education, how much wealth you have, what your stature is, what your ability is, or how you view yourself. God can and does use small to overcome. He uses the lesser to be greater. Small things inconsequential things are just the kind of things that God uses to revolutionize a world. Listen to Proverbs 6:6. Take a lesson from the ants, you lazy bones. Learn from their ways and become wise. Though they have no prince or governor or ruler to make them work, they labor hard all summer, gathering food for the winter. Ants, small, but the Proverbs give us a lesson that pays off. Listen to some of the takeaways. There is a singularity of focus among ants. They are working together for their survival. You ever notice that? Their whole purpose is to survive. So they work together and they go get food, and they are tenacious in focus. They will not be deterred. They take advantage of their time. They are relentless. If there is time, they're gathering. They know that time matters. And they aren't deterred easy. If you're trying to eliminate ants, in reality, all you're really doing is giving them a detour. You're just moving them. You put ant killer in your yard, they'll move to your neighbors, right? I don't suggest that today, by the way. Another example is found in 1 Samuel chapter 14, and we looked at this about 3 weeks ago. Jonathan says, let's go across to the outpost of those pagans. Jonathan said to his armor bearer, perhaps the Lord will help us, for nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle whether he has many warriors or only a few. And when we looked at that story of Jonathan, here's some things that we recalled. Jonathan and his armor bearer showed great resolve in facing the Philistine army alone. The rest of the army was sitting under a pomegranate tree with Saul, their fearless leader. They weren't concerned with the odds that were against them or dissuaded by the lack of others who refused to fight. They were the few. Jonathan and his armor bearer realized that was their vision and singularity of purpose, like the ant. God had said, the Philistines are yours for the taking. Go do it. And they had a purpose. He wasn't going to sit aside and wait for something to happen. He acted, even though it was he and his armor bearer. Jonathan wasn't concerned about the outcome, but rather the obedience. Notice the language. He says, perhaps the Lord will be on our side. Jonathan knew that God didn't need many or big. He could win with a few or little. In 1 Samuel 17, listen to verse 38. Then Saul gave David his own armor, a bronze helmet, and a coat of mail. David put it on, strapped the sword over it, and took a step or two to see what it was like, for he had never worn such things before. I can't go in these, he protested to Saul. I'm not used to them. So David took them off. He picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them into his shepherd's bag. Then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. David, a small shepherd boy, he was wise enough to realize what he didn't need. He didn't need the king's armor, the king's mail, and the king's sword. All he needed was simple stones crafted by God in time as the water rushed over them, made ready for him to pick up with his sling. Small in stature, small in weaponry, and yet God used them and they work. David prepared for that time. He had practiced in the fields as a shepherd, and he had protected the sheep from the lion and the bear, and had used those very instruments before to keep the varmints from coming in and getting the sheep. And so when the time came for him to stand up, it wasn't like he wasn't unprepared. He was ready. He didn't have to think about the technique. Well, if I hold my elbow just right and I swing it just this number of times, this is what that stone's going to do. He didn't have to think about all that. There was Goliath. There's his purpose. There's his goal. Here I am. I'm ready. God honored that. God honored his preparedness and was ready. And when he was ready to be used, God used him. Here's a couple things for us. We need to remind ourselves of God's plan for the world. It's salvation. It's salvation. We are the messengers, the hands and feet of a king. It's God's plan to use us, as small and inconsequential as we may think we are. God wants to use you and me. That's the way it works. We're to go and make disciples. Now, some of the activities we do need a funeral. Some of our attitudes that we've gathered over time need to be tossed aside. Our focus has been blurred by our activity. I'll say that one again. Our focus has been blurred by our activity. We're so busy doing things for God that sometimes we fail to do things with God. We need to remind ourselves that we are in this together. It works best when we are all doing our part. When each of us are locking shields with one another and standing in the gap for those who have no hope. The scriptures tell us that each of us has a role to play, that we each have gifts and abilities, and they're different. And when we play those, the way an orchestra or a symphony works best together when all the parts are playing, that's the way we as the church, as the body, functions best. Allowing a few people to do this much and then this much of people doing this much isn't God's best, and it's not God's design. Sitting out is not a role. It's not. There is no age limit on the Great Commission. Thirdly, we need to copy the ant and that we're not easily turned away. We rented a house in Siloam when we first moved there, and it was the back of it was built on blocks, so it was on a severely sloping lot. And so, sure enough, the ants would come in, and it was a wood house, and so it's just it was like an invitation for the ant colonies to come and visit. And I would go and treat that back, and they would just scoot around. And then I'd go treat that side, and then they would come back. They would not be deterred. Resistance didn't scare them. They just changed direction and came at it again. When we get resistance, unfortunately, we tend to quit, right? We forget that we're on God's army that will prevail. We forget that 50.3% of the people in Springdale claim no religious affiliation. Of that other 50 that claim some kind of religious affiliation, how many of them are really rightly related to God and attending church and serving the Lord? It's few, right? The needs are great. When you go knock on a door and they slam the door in your face, that's resistance. So we quit knocking on doors. We quit inviting our neighbors over because really, you know what? They don't think like us and talk like us. Reaching people for Christ is not easy. And it's gotten to the point where because we felt resistance and it's just easier to be among Christian people that we folded up our tents and said it's too hard. That becomes more apparent as we see that denominational churches are dying. If you look at all the major Protestant denominations, Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, every year it's a significant decline in population every single year for the last 15 years. There's no growth in our denomination. There's more churches that baptize 0 in Arkansas than baptize 1. We've become complacent. We've become lazy because it's hard. And when we ran into resistance, we quit and let somebody else do it. Small things. Small in stature. Small in power. You don't have to have a pedigree of a king or be seminary trained or educated to be a person that's used by God. He takes the simple. He takes the shepherd and brings down the giants. If you're looking around letting someone else do the work because you don't think God could use you because of your past, If you're looking around and thinking that God can't use you because you don't have enough influence or not enough money or enough skills or enough talent or enough ability, you're shortchanging the God of the universe that says you can. The tools that you have are enough to do your part. You don't need a special equipping. Once you realize that you and I cannot pay the price for our sin, and Jeff mentioned it earlier. Once we realize that no matter how hard we work, no matter what we do, it's not enough to pay the penalty of sin. And once we realize that Jesus paid that penalty of our sin for us so that we can have fellowship with God, we've got enough. You have a story. God redeemed you from death and brought you into life, and that's enough. It's a great story. Redemption works. Your story of embracing Christ speaks volumes to those who don't know Him. Tell you that we need to do a better job of developing what God has given us so that when the moment comes, we're ready. David practiced for hours, perhaps. And when the moment to face the giant of Goliath came, he didn't have to think. He just did. For most of you here, you have literally heard hundreds of hours of sermons and many, many hours of Bible study. And for many, the chance encounter of sharing the good news with Christ has never happened in your life. The chance to tell one person what God has done for you has escaped you. Perhaps it's because we think we're too small. Perhaps it's because we think somebody's better. But that's a tragedy. You have what it takes. This past week, I read an article about a book that I haven't gotten yet. It's written by Tom Rainier, who's the CEO of Lifeway Resources, i.e. your Sunday school materials, Lifeway Christian stores. And the book title is Autopsy of a Dying Church. And in it, the review was telling some of the things that he had learned as he chronicles his relationship with a church that had hired him to come and consult why they were dying. And apparently the church was experiencing a period of decline, and an extended period of decline. It was in a neighborhood that was no longer white middle class. Everything around them was changing. And so they met with him and requested some consultation. And after quite a bit of time with him, he made a list and said, these are the things that I think you can implement to change and to grow and to be part of the incredible life-changing nature of the gospel in the community that you're planted. They voted to reject his suggestions. And in short time, they closed with money in the bank. Now, EBC has a rich history. It has a long road behind it of ups and downs, of triumphs and victories and defeats and periods of peace and periods of conflict and periods of change and periods of different leaders. That's all true. The future is a little less uncertain. You say, how can that be? It just is. With the average age of the church membership here far outweighing the age of the youth, where will you be? What does the next chapter of your life look like? And that next chapter will determine your legacy. For many of you, you say, I'm just one, what can I do? For many of you say, we are a small church with a small amount of money and small amount of resources. What can we do? For many of you say, the staff is not doing their job. As soon as we get a pastor, we'll be ready. If the staff would just lead better and the staff would be more evangelistic, if the preacher would preach about hell and damnation, we'd be there. Without that, what are we going to do? Some of you may say, my best days are behind me. I don't have the energy that I once had. I'll let someone else do it. Besides, I am older. What can I do? The reality is this. God doesn't need big, educated, trained, complicated, resource-rich, staff-led, young to change communities, to change families, to change adults, and to change children. Throughout history, God has and does use small things. And here's the good news. He wants to use you. And he wants to use me. The enemy would tell you you're not worth it. The enemy would tell you you have no voice. The enemy would tell you that you're too small. The enemy would tell you to let somebody else do it. It's their turn. God is asking you to be a part. God is asking you to be a part of his plan to revolutionize this community. So, church, what will you do? What is your next chapter? What legacy will you leave? What will be said of Elmdale a decade from today? Will we be standing on this corner celebrating what God has done, or counting our days as we have one funeral after another? I don't know. But we serve a great God who is able. He is applauding you and cheering you on and saying, get involved. You have an invitation. There's more to be done. There are people who don't know him right here in our midst. The invitation is clear. Rise up, church. Rise up. Let me finish by saying this. Some of you don't know Christ. You've never embraced the claims of Christ for yourself. So being a part of his plan, you're still trying to figure that out. The sacrifice that Christ made on the cross for you makes it possible for you to know him. And that's a personal decision. And we'd like to help you make that decision. And if you find yourself in that place, in just a minute, come down and talk to Steve. We'd love to walk with you in that journey, to help you embrace the claims of Christ and to accept the payment that he made. For some of you, it's been a long time. And the fruits of your life, apart from your religious activity, meaning church, don't really show much. That can change. Do you realize that Caleb was 85 years old when he answered the call yet again to go fight for the Lord? We don't have to have a time frame or a skill set or a seminary degree. God says, you are mine and I will use you. Perhaps you know family that's in this church that are setting it out. They're not here. They're on the roll, but they're not going anywhere. And they'll say things like, well, I don't do that church thing because of people. They're not, they're hypocrites. Well, if they claim to be a church follower, a Christ follower, and they're not in church, and they're living the way of the world, they're guilty as charged. And it's our job to exercise a little church discipline and say, hey, rather than throw stones at us, join us. Come back. You know them. Invite them. Engage them. Some of you may be in this room finding yourself in that same place. You're just here by chance, but you're still skeptical about believers around you. What are you going to do? Let's stand and pray.